Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak today. It's great. I popped in last year as well, and it's been an absolute pleasure over the last couple of years working alongside the farming community. For those who don't know me, my name is Piers. I'm an ecologist here in the island, and I have been working with the dairy farm, particularly in their movement to become LEAF accredited, and particularly working with the biodiversity side of it. I was asked to speak today because members here had seen me speak about farming and biodiversity at the Jersey Biodiversity Conference last year. Obviously, this is a bit different. As last year, I was trying to get across to some of the island's environmental cohort how important farming is to the island's biodiversity. But I know you guys already know that, so I don't have to repeat myself. I will, however, start with the last slide from last year, as I think this is important to remember when talking about farming and biodiversity in the island. If it works. Where do I need to point it? There we go. The farming takes up over 50% of the island. That means under suitable management strategies, the agricultural industry has the potential to single-handedly do more to protect more of our island's biodiversity than any other NGO or government organisation in the island. So for all of those that normally knock down farming, farming is actually going to be the solution. And I think that's really important to remember. So today what I want to go through is nothing overly specific, but I kind of want to put thoughts in people's minds for how farming can look at biodiversity and how to look at the landscape for biodiversity when you're working on the farmscape and species that you work with. Thank you. So Jersey's habitat has always been changing, and although the island may have once been a dense wilderness, as sort of shown on your left-hand side, it hasn't probably been in that state for at least 4,000 years. And the landscape that we have today is probably more reminiscent of what we had 2,000 years ago, and it hasn't actually changed that much in that time. We've had a bit of forest come, we've had a bit of forest go, but realistically, we are an agricultural island. So 2,000 years ago, that's the Romans. So we're going back that far. And our wildlife has evolved alongside us to work in an agricultural island. Thank you. Even some of our most important ecological sites are extremely young. Now, I can see Peter LeMaitre laughing at this one because he spotted where it is. This is Grooval Marsh SSI, 1945, so at the end of the war. And today, it is now the second most important ecological site on the island. It's young. It's really, really young. In terms of, it's like we don't have ancient landscapes on Jersey. Jersey has been so crafted and artificially manicured over the years. We do not have ancient woodland. We don't have anything like that. We've got habitats that have gone extinct in the island, thanks to German walls. We've lost all our salt marshes. Most of our freshwater landscapes are all artificial. So we live in an island which is sculpted around agriculture. And because of that, the wildlife has adapted to us being here in the island. In fact, there's a fantastic book at the moment, Rebirding. And in it, he's talking about potential rewilding birds to Britain, particularly things like Dalmatian pelican. But he points out the concept that in Britain, and same applies for Jersey, the concept of wildlife is potentially misconstrued because no wildlife has been wild from human activity for thousands of years in our landscapes. This isn't the back end of Europe or anywhere like that. We've always had a very close relationship with the wildlife around us, and it comes down to how we manage it. Now, many of you will know I'm a bit of a fan of LEAF, and it is fantastic that we have this standard that has been brought into the island. What I like about it is not that it's just a tick box standard, but a progressive standard where there is a requirement to update and improve it. You've got to prove that you're doing more. And because of this, I've actually joined the LEAF Technical Advisory Committee to help develop the standards and hopefully bring a bit more Jersey to them to help make them a bit more applicable. And from a biodiversity point of view, evidence is so important for choosing the right actions to take on your farm to actually ensure what you are doing is beneficial to the wildlife. It is so easy to go out and do something that's in a textbook. The only way to know if that is the right action is to have the evidence there. You can inadvertently cause a lot of ecological damage, the right thing or the wrong thing for the right reasons. So it is important to have this evidence, and LEAF promotes this about collecting information and monitoring. And modern conservation, it's typical for often responding to knee-jerk reactions, potentially very political ones, and often taking ideas from other districts and other countries without it actually being relatable to the area that is actually being worked in, which means it doesn't take account of all the species and everything like that. So the fact that sort of like LEAF and the integrated farm management really sort of hones down on what's happening on your farms and what wildlife you have is one of the big things I really love about it. Okay, so I'm sure sort of everyone here, so this is why I kind of want to go into sort of ideas about how to look at landscape and how to look at farming. Particularly things like everyone's been talked about connective corridors and linking up landscapes and what you've got to do on fields and sort of how to connect them all together. But I thought I would try and get this across as sort of the landscape scales that we are dealing with in Jersey. So on this map here, I've just dumped a 30-hectare area, which is pretty standard for a lot of fields in the UK. And if you look at the LEAF standards, they talk about fields which are over 20 hectares and upwards, requiring separations in between them to help break them up. You can note within our 30-hectare area, there's a heck of a lot of field margins, hedgerows and grass banks going throughout that. So you can sort of see even right from the start, our fields are already really well divided. And to give you an indication of how divided that is, assuming that each of those is no more than 2 meters wide, it equates to, within that 30-hectare area, it equates to half a hectare of marginal habitat. That is the requirement for marginal strips under LEAF standards for an open field of allowing for a 2-meter buffer. It is the same area, and we've got that without having to put anything extra in. So this is how do you look at your landscape? Do you look at it as the individual field where you're saying you've got to try and get marginal habitat in? Or do you start looking at the bigger block and actually look at how much marginal habitat you have within a certain area? As I say, I'm not saying what's right and what's wrong here. It's food for thought of how you look at managing it. Because I know a lot of people want to start putting hedgerows everywhere, but there's nothing wrong with having a grass bank splitting 2 fields. They have that in the sort of the standard, sort of as a beetle bank, a habitat bank. There's nothing wrong with that. The edges of our fields do not have to be the edges of our fields. They can be habitats between 2 areas of work land. So it's trying to think outside the box and how we look at the habitat that way. So Jersey is starting off in a really good place. But obviously, it's not as simple, as it is unlikely that that whole block is farmed by the same person. So it's not going to fall under the same responsibility. As an indication, this is a map of the Jersey dairy farmland that I work with. And you can sort of see there are very few blocks of land collectively put together which we can sort of manage across. And this also causes an added conundrum for if you are part of the LEAF standards and you choose your key species. In the UK and other continent farms, it's more likely that a single farm can solely support populations of wildlife. But in Jersey, that will not be the case. Our wildlife moves around, and it moves a lot. Now, the farms I'm working with are looking out for a range of key species. Some, like the glowworm at La Ferme, are fairly sedentary. They're staying more or less in one place. But we've also got a range of farms which are looking at barn owls. We've got 9 farms which are looking at bats. These animals move across the whole island. So what you do on one farm may not be enough to actually support the wildlife you're choosing as a key species. So it's a case of starting to consider linking up. How many farms can be looking at the same key species, so the management's going in the same way to support it across the whole island? And a perfect example of that is insects and insectivorous birds. If you're trying to look after them and promote them, but maybe next door might be a bit more heavy-handed on the pesticides, you're not really going to be getting very far with actually helping supply them with food and other habitat. So what's the solution? In my view, we as an island need to go beyond what sort of standards we are already looking at and not look at biodiversity within the silo of each farm, but look at it as the island's commitment together towards improving biodiversity. And we are already starting to get there. Start of this year, Jersey Dairy Farms took part in the first winter farmland bird count across the island, which we've got fantastic results for here. So that was over one morning, we went out and we counted what we could see across all the different farms. So this is really great for starting to see population trends of different birds. And as we hopefully will keep doing this in the years to come, we will get to see more and more species and actually start to get some really good records and trend data of where we can find these species. We've also got mass hedgerow planting around the island, although I could probably have a whole debate about that on a different day. But we need to start looking bigger. Are there collections of field that benefit from ground nesting birds? Should fields potentially be bigger? Because everyone sort of says, don't rip out a hedgerow, but maybe that's not the solution. Maybe the solution is to actually make your field bigger, rip out the hedgerow in the middle, but move it to the side, so you're not changing it, but you then have larger marginal habitat, which is better for the wildlife, and you've got an easier area to work in the middle. Considering what you do with bits of land which are not in farming. So here's a perfect example. I'm sorry if this is one of your fields in here and you're starting to feel guilty. You shouldn't. But these edge strips, I mean, they're around most of the potato fields. I mean, my question, you might have the answer to this, is in the first place, if you know that that's going to be your tractor track, does it need to be ploughed up and cultivated in the first place? Can it be left as grass and you just drive over the grass? No harm in that. Equally, is it possible to run round after the main crop has gone in and you put a marginal seed crop in, grass crop in there to help bind the soil, create a little bit of extra habitat, and improve the biodiversity of that? Otherwise, that's just sitting bare and baking, and when the rain comes down, you get runoff and everything. But those are the type of bits that we need to start considering across the island, and you start linking up these tracks the whole way across the island, and you suddenly can have a huge area of routes for wildlife to use that previously weren't there. So small activities such as linking multiple sites and fields with connection strips, joint discussions between farm when you're doing land swaps. One that I see quite often is wild bird mixes. There is no point putting a wild bird mix in if that field is destined to be turned over to potatoes in January. Wild bird mixes, they need to be until March, which is quite late. So you need to choose the right fields for the right application. And talking across the different farms, particularly when land swaps are going on, over whose management is what. And this is the whole thing of linking up a bit more and having joint ventures between the farms which are using that bit of land. So as an idea, this map shows the current land available in Jersey that can be potentially managed for biodiversity. These are all the sort of the agricultural fields that are marked up, which can be either grazed or planted. Obviously, there's a whole load of horse grazing on there as well. But you can sort of see the scope of land that is available, that the agricultural sector can help invest in for biodiversity. And it's a lot more than the national park. It's a lot more than St Wan's Bay. And it's full of fantastic areas. And there is so much wildlife tucked in amongst all these fields that does not get the recognition it deserves. With a little bit of change of management, a little bit of improvement, we could achieve so much more on it. Jersey needs to and is ready to go beyond the standards to demonstrate how effectively agriculture can be the solution to wildlife conservation. And I truly believe that. It's not just me trying to big you guys up and not have stuff thrown at me. I really do believe that agriculture is going to be the way forward. Now, obviously in Jersey, we are never going to be able to have something like the Net Reserve, Safari Reserve, or the newer one in Essex, I think started out with rewilding. We just don't have the space. We don't have the herbivores for it. But the correct use and the correct grazing for using the dairy cattle and other livestock as well, mixed in with good rotation over the arable crops as well, we are still going to be able to achieve the same effect. And this comes back to also the fact that we haven't had large herbivores roaming around on Jersey for thousands of years. They haven't been here. So we haven't had the natural grazers, which are commonly associated with these large open areas of land, which are the landscape architects. So they have gone, Jersey's landscape architects has been agriculture, and it will continue to be agriculture. And quite frankly, without agriculture, we will lose biodiversity quite significantly. I hope I've given some food for thought, and I'm always happy to chat wildlife if you're ever after some advice. One of my final thoughts on this is maybe it's time that actually we need to be actually looking at, for the agriculture industry, to have a biodiversity project coordinator which can operate over all the farms, single point of contact that can coordinate all these fantastic plans that are happening under LEAF, under own steams and own initiatives, and actually have it all coordinated so we can have the maximum biodiversity from the sector for our island's biodiversity. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Piers. I have a couple of questions for you. The first one, concerned that it's been mentioned that we need to build on green fields to meet growing demand for housing. How can we mitigate against this to help maintain and improve biodiversity?
Jersey needs to look at adopting what the UK has, which is net biodiversity gain. And that puts a lot more strength over where new projects are being developed. They need to be able to say that actually, after that project is developed, they have achieved more for biodiversity, there's more habitat, or starting to look at biodiversity offset. As some of you know, I do ecological surveys for developments here in Jersey. One of my annoyances is there is not a case of sometimes where developers can't help, where they could actually donate towards a fund where we can specifically look at funding projects as an offset measure. It's quite a complicated thing of trying to work out what will work depending on what's being affected, but there are ways around to do it, and I think Jersey really needs to start exploring these a bit better rather than sort of shrugging them off a bit.
Okay, and the final question is, what species should a farm choose as a key species for their farm's enhancement plans?
Right, so sort of under LEAF, there's a requirement to choose at least one, ideally 4 key species. My advice to clients that I've worked with is always choose a species which is actually relevant to the farm, not just go with a species which you know people talk about a lot. So it's worth choosing species which means something. So if you've gone for barn owls, they relate to small mammals, which relates to crop health in the landscape. Bats relate to how many insects are flying around, so the overall quality of your habitat around you, and you're using these key species to indicate that, but they're directly relatable to the farm activities. We do have some species which people are like, yes, you need to look after them, but they have no direct relation to actually the farm's undertaking. They just come in or go out. So it's important to choose species along that way, and also to choose one that you're interested in. Quite frankly, if you're not interested in the species that you're choosing to be your key species, you're not going to pay attention to it. So choose something that you're interested in, whether it's glowworms, bats, birds. There's huge variety out there.
Brilliant, Piers. Thank you very much indeed.